In this last lecture for this week, I hope to put some of the early decisions of the Marshall Court into their proper context. Although we are focusing on Supreme Court opinions in our reading, as I advised in the last lecture, I don't think you can understand these opinions out of their specific historical context. Likewise, some of the greatest and most important constitutional developments in the founding era occurred outside the Supreme Court. And our Supreme Court centric narrative of constitutional history is really, really deficient. And we want to move through some of the principal constitutional developments in the Jeffersonian era and consider their implications. And then I want you to use this history as the contextual materials with which you will interpret the true meaning of these Supreme Court cases that we're reading, both now and throughout the course of the semester. Now, we should start actually with trends that occur entirely out of the realm of the Supreme Court, and involves two in particular. One is the expansion of the suffrage, and the other is the progress of First Amendment religious liberty, disestablishment. And if you actually follow the Supreme Court-centric narrative, neither of these have any meaning whatsoever until we get to the latter 19th century in terms of suffrage expansion, and really the late 20th century in terms of understanding religious liberty. But both of them actually have a very robust constitutional history in the early part of the 19th century. First of all, Jefferson had long urged an expansion of the suffrage along Democratic lines, and so too did all of the Democratic Republicans. And they specifically aimed at eliminating the property requirements which were universal at the time of the Constitution's ratification. Maryland became the first state to expand the suffrage to all white males by statute in 1801, and then by constitutional amendment in 1810. Other southern states followed suit, not all of them, but many did. And northern states would follow almost one after the other after Maine was admitted in 1819 on the basis of universal white manhood suffrage. Virginia would be one of the lone holdouts. In fact, the last of the holdouts. It held on to its property requirements until 1851. And many other states kind of sprinkled around the country held on to property requirements until the 1840s. But this is a process which is firmly begun in the period between 1800 and 1820. It expands the suffrage in such a way as to fundamentally change the nature of constitutional interpretation and the meaning of democratic citizenship. It's not, by the way, a wholly progressive history, because at the same time that the suffrage is expanded along democratic lines, it's restricted on two other bases, one being race, the other being sex. So, for instance, when New Jersey took the vote or extended the vote to unpropertied white males, they also restricted the voting by propertied single women at the same time. So women who had been enfranchised under certain circumstances before 1820 found themselves losing that franchise. And it's not often that they are, but the fact that it's taken away from them at the same time it's extended along the property line is significant. The same thing happens with free blacks. They voted, for instance, in North Carolina, to take a southern example, and they would continue to vote in North Carolina until 1835, but then it would be taken away from them. In Maryland, which in 1801 extended the property or extended the suffrage across property lines. In 1810, they secured this by constitutional amendment that simultaneously disenfranchised their free black population. And northern states do this as well. So, for instance, New York essentially adopts universal manhood suffrage in 1826. At the same time, they restrict the voting by free blacks in such a way that they do it by property qualification that essentially disenfranchises their entire free black population. So suffrage expansion occurs alongside with restriction, and it changes the nature of what citizenship means. And this is an important thing to understand. We're going to talk about what constitutes citizenship by the time we get to 1860, and we have to understand it in these terms. The second thing regards religious liberty, and Jefferson himself, of course, had long been a proponent of disestablishment. He's one who authors that great Virginia statute on disestablishment. He also writes the very famous letter to the Danbury Baptists of Connecticut, I believe it's 1805. I'll let you look up the date, but he writes the very famous letter to the Danbury Baptists where he urges that they support a separation of church and state, and by which he means, of course, the actual disestablishment of religion. He's not talking about freedom of conscience, which was almost universally recognized as being important, but rather he wants to see the states stop supporting religion with tax dollars, so that you are not compelled to support one particular religion over another particular religion. And by the 1820s, all the states are disestablishing their established churches. So disestablishment as a principle of religious liberty proceeds and is really largely completed by 1830. And that's, once again, one of the Jeffersonians all want to see this happen. It's part of their constitutional program. So I want people to understand that the context of constitutional history is really taking place outside the court in most respects. And certainly when it does happen inside the court, we need to consider the context outside of the court to be able to firmly understand what's happening inside the court. So these are two larger trends to keep in mind, particularly, by the way, that religious liberty question, which I've painted in a progressive direction. But as we'll see, post-1820, we start to see some fairly restrictive thinking that's going on, aimed mainly at behavior, and that has to be taken in context with this question of disestablishment. So let us return now to the Democratic Republicans. Now, the victory of the Democratic Republicans in the election of 1800 did lead to a number of constitutional developments. And I want to make clear here that anytime a political election is won, in America at least, it's usually done so on two grounds, and it certainly was in 1800 and 1801. One of them is the grounds of policy. The other is the grounds of the Constitution. By policy, we mean political programs, the constitutionality of which were not disputed, but the wisdom of which were. So, for instance, whether to go to war with France, or whether to enact an excise tax on whiskey, or a particular customs duty, is a policy question. And part of Jefferson's victory, and for that matter, the victory of all the Democratic Republicans in 1801, was to reverse these policies of the Federalists, to eliminate taxes, to shore up friendship with the French and be more hostile towards the British, and so on and so forth. There are also constitutional grounds, however, in their argument. The Democratic Republicans believed that the Constitution had been manipulated and, in fact, perverted by Federalists. And so they promised to roll back not just unwise policies, but unconstitutional extensions of federal power. And along these lines, of course, Jefferson had pardoned people convicted under the Sedition Act, ordered district attorneys not to continue prosecutions under the law. The National Bank, another example of something that Jefferson thought unconstitutional. In that case, he settled, as did the rest of the Democratic Republicans, with the selling of the government's share in the National Bank rather than the repeal of its charter. Nonetheless, these early constitutional positions of the Democratic Republicans would revolve around a particular set of constitutional principles that we need to understand. They are the principles of strict construction. Strict constructionists, and this is something which occurs in, well, as we'll see, this is a philosophy of constitutional interpretation that is only being developed in the 1790s around the novel question of how do we interpret a constitution. Now, I very briefly outlined the primary assumptions and conclusions of strict constructionists, but this by no means exhausts the field, and it is not meant to be comprehensive. Strict constructionism is actually much more complicated than I've laid it out here, and you'll see this as you start to read strict constructionists. But we should begin with several very universal assumptions, and these first three assumptions are actually held by nationalists as well as by strict constructionists. The first assumption is that sovereignty lies with the people and not with any particular government. This is what's articulated, by the way, by James Madison in his famous speech during the ratification debates in Philadelphia in the fall of 1787. So you begin with the idea that sovereignty lies with the people, not with any particular government. This means, of course, that you have two basic grants in the American system. The first is the people's grant to the state governments, which is a general and broad grant, and it is to be interpreted as a general and broad grant. The grant to the federal government, however, is specific and limited. It's limited to a specific number of goals and a specific number of enumerated powers. The final assumption is that people reserve their natural rights and that they cannot part with their natural rights. And this is a primary assumption of liberal political theory. It is a truism. Everybody believes it. The question, of course, is what precisely are natural rights and how natural rights are to be understood. And that's a much larger question than we'll get into. But this takes us to two conclusions. And I almost dislike calling them conclusions because the assumptions and reasoning upon which they lie are not very clearly laid out here in this diagram. But they are two conclusions of the strict constructionists that would set them apart from the nationalists. And the first of the conclusions is that limited powers, we go back to that second assumption, the limited powers of the national government means that all which is not included is excluded. Expressio unius est exclusior alterius is the common law maxim that is being applied here. It's a form of legal reasoning. And what it means literally is that the express mention of one thing excludes, by implication, all others. So if you have a list of things, like a list of enumerated powers, then that specific list means that things on that list were not included for a reason. So that's the principle of construction which is being used by the strict constructionists to interpret the Constitution as a grant. This much must be clear. This is how Jefferson pens his own attack on the National Bank when he's asked about its constitutionality as a member of Washington's cabinet in 1791. Another conclusion, and this will be much more important later on, particularly as we near secession, and is, again, disputed by the nationalists, and in fact rejected by the nationalists, is that the federal government is the result of a compact entered into by sovereign states. So this is when we talk about the strict constructionists, this very much is a conclusion that they draw. And when we think about the strict constructionists, we should think about this as something in formation. And Thomas Jefferson is one of its early luminaries. So too is John Taylor of Caroline, eventually Judge Spencer Roane as well. And probably nobody more so than Henry St. George Tucker, who in the early aughts begins penning his commentaries on Blackstone. And Blackstone, of course, you'll remember, wrote the commentaries on the Law of England. And Tucker publishes them with his own commentaries on the Constitution of the United States, where he lays out the principles of strict construction and he lays out the compact theory of the Constitution. And so this is oftentimes thought of as the Virginia School. I don't like thinking of it as the Virginia School, because opposed to the Virginia School would be the Virginian John Marshall and other Virginians like James Madison. So to call it the Virginia School, because it's composed of these prominent Virginians, is a little misleading. Virginians oppose the Virginian School, but this is the Virginian School of strict constructionism. Let's return to what's actually happening. And I didn't talk about, I should do this really, really quickly. So before we go to the Virginia School, I want to get to these final two conclusions. The nationalists, like I said, disputed both of them. And what the principles that the broad constructionists laid out were fairly simple to put in contrast to this. Rather than using the expressio unius est exclusio alterius maxim to interpret the Constitution, the broad constructionists, which began really with Alexander Hamilton, argue that it's the ends of the national government that are limited, and that those ends imply whatever means are necessary to achieve it. And that's another legal maxim, actually. The ends, when the ends are granted, the means are implied. And that maxim of common law construction, and for that matter, statutory construction, is what the broad constructionists use to justify the extension of federal power to achieve a desired end. And regarding the compact theory, as we've seen in our discussion about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions and the disputes really between Madison and Jefferson, they don't regard the federal government as a result of the compact by the sovereign states, but by the people of the sovereign states. So it was the people operating in their corporate capacity in the states, not the people, or rather not the states themselves that created it. This is very much part of Madisonian theory. And as I have tried to point out, it's heavily disputed here going into the 1790s and the 1800s. So let's turn from this to Jefferson, who very much was a strict constructionist and remained, by the way, an avowed strict constructionist throughout his life. Let's talk about two major developments during the Jefferson presidency. The first is the Louisiana Purchase, and the second is the embargo. In both cases, I'm going to assume that you know the basic outlines of the history regarding the early 19th century and what exactly these things are. If you don't, you need to familiarize yourself with them because I'm not going to explain them in any detail. The Louisiana Territory was purchased from France in 1803. Congress had authorized Jefferson to negotiate for the city of New Orleans, a vital port for Western commerce. Given that the Western settlement had hastened after the victory over the Ohio, County, Miami, and Delaware in 1795, securing of the port was essential to opening the navigation on the Mississippi. The constitutional issue that is broached when the constitutional issue is broached when France makes the Americans a surprise offer in 1803. Do they want to purchase the whole of French territory? Now, this would mean, if we go to our map of the Louisiana territory, this would mean suddenly that rather than simply negotiating for the Port of New Orleans and for the navigation of the Mississippi River, rather than just that, they are suddenly in the business of buying territory. Now, if you're a strict constructionist, think about this. You start looking to what the enumerated powers of Congress are. The only mention regarding territories is really in Article 4, Section 3, and it includes making needful rules and regulations for territory. There's no specific mention about the purchase of territory. So if one follows a strict constructional interpretation, then Congress had no constitutional warrant to purchase territory whatsoever. So what does Jefferson do? Well, he ignored strict construction in that point. And in fact, in a letter, he suggested that the less said about it, the better. He instructs people to ignore it before Congress and let the purchase go forward. It's too good an opportunity to turn down. It's not, by the way, I should be clear here. It's not that strict constructionists couldn't maybe torture their theory to get it to work out that they could purchase territory since it was unmentioned, but to do so immediately moves in the direction that the broad constructionists had initially construed, and that is or asserted rather, that the ends assume the means to finish it. So if the end is the acquisition of, or if the acquisition of territory serves one of the ends of government, then they should be able to do it. Now, I should point out here that the actual crisis over let's not call it a crisis because there's not really a constitutional crisis with the Louisiana Purchase. The constitutional issues that come out of the Louisiana Purchase are far greater than the actual constitutional issue that goes into it. So, for instance, the purchase of Louisiana Territory will ultimately hasten the spread of slavery westward. This is depicted here in a painting called After the Sale at Richmond. And in fact, a lot of the Eastern slaves, including those in Virginia, find their way westward as a result of this Louisiana Purchase. So that issue, of course, is going to dominate American constitutionality for the next 60 years. There's also the question of Indian relations, and this is actually a picture of the Treaty of Fort Greenville, which occurs in 1795, removes the Miami and other tribes, noticeably the Delaware, out of the Ohio River Valley. And this occurs in 1795, and it actually hastens Western development. The other thing, of course, about the Louisiana Territory was that it gave the United States a whole new territory to induce the Indians to remove themselves to, and when they didn't, to remove them by force, as they did with the Cherokee in the case of the Trail of Tears. Now, there's another bit of intrigue that comes out of the Louisiana Purchase. It involves Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr had disgraced himself during the 1801 crisis over presidential succession, and he disgraces himself further by killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel. But Burr escaped punishment by fleeing the prosecution. This is prosecution, obviously, for the murder of Alexander Hamilton. He ended up in this new federal territory, where he put together a scheme that involved attacking Spanish possessions in the Southwest. The scheme may or may not have included, by the way, the creation of a new nation-state carved out of U.S. territory, which Burr would personally rule over. Burr's conspirators ultimately turned him in, and Burr faced trial in a federal circuit court. John Marshall would preside over that trial. During the trial, Marshall gave a plain reading of the Constitution that defined treason as, and here he gives a plain reading, as levying war against the United States or giving aid and comfort to its enemies. A treasonable design, in other words, a plan to carry out treason, was not enough, in Marshall's estimation, to constitute treason under the Constitution. In construing the Constitution this way, Marshall dispensed with the English idea of constructive treason. Now, you should take note that this actually defied the typical Federalist line that there was a federal common law incorporated into the organic law of the United States. This is a very savvy move by Marshall. He manages to acquit Jefferson's biggest enemy, and Aaron Burr, by employing Jefferson's principles of strict construction. Notice as well that he was deploying one of Blackstone's rules of statutory construction. That is, that all penal statutes need to be construed strictly. And here I urge you to go back and look at the lecture from week 4. It's lecture 1, The Rise of Parliament and the Curbing of Judicial Discretion. In that lecture, I discussed what Blackstone's rules of statutory construction were. Now, what's interesting here is that Marshall is borrowing from these rules to read a constitution, to construe the Constitution. And it's noticeable that he's really using this rule here in the case. And this would ultimately come up, of course, before the full bench of the Supreme Court in Ex parte Bowman, which we'll read this week. Now, the second major issue during the Jefferson presidency is the embargo. It was, on its face, a simple matter. In light of British outrages to American shipping during the Napoleonic Wars, Jefferson asked for an embargo on British manufactures. Nothing shipped in, nothing shipped out. It was the old commercial weapon that had been deployed since Revolutionary days, and the Democratic-Republican Congress complied, providing both for an embargo on shipping and its enforcement. But what authority did Congress have to prevent imports and exports? It was a Navigation Act, to be sure, and this meant that it fell under the Commerce Clause. But did the Commerce Clause include the power to prohibit commerce? It is noticeable here that the Democratic Republicans, who generally were strict constructionists, here took the broad view, arguing that the power to regulate included the power to exclude. Meanwhile, disaffected Federalists, overwhelmingly located in New England, protested the embargo as unconstitutional and flirted with designs of secession and disunion. It was enough to prompt a number of prominent Federalists, John Quincy Adams key among them, to switch allegiance to the Democratic Republicans during this time. Now, this I should mention here that the second term, Jefferson's second term, is widely regarded as a disaster, but it followed on the heels of not just a successful first term, but a term that ends with an overwhelming Democratic-Republican victory. The Federalists are never going to hold the presidency again, and they start to lose offices more and more and more. And as you can see, by 1804, even New England is voting in large part for Democratic-Republicans. And as far as the embargo goes, it is an absolute disaster. Smuggling is rampant throughout New England. It hurts every single state, and probably none more so than Virginia, which loses its major market for exports, and with its inability to drive the export of tobacco, enters into a prolonged decline. And Virginia will continue to decline. I think that decline ends sometime in 1978 or something like that. Maybe 1982, I don't know. But Virginia is in bad shape following this, and so too is New England. Now, the other effect, by the way, of the Louisiana Purchase and actually more so than just the Louisiana Purchase, but also the victory in 1795 over the Miami and the Delaware in the Ohio country, is a steady movement westward of population. And this is important to understand. The density of population, if you look at 1800, the density of population is still along the seaboard with small pockets now forming along the Ohio River. By 1810, we have substantial westward movement. And this means that new centers of power are opening up across the Appalachians. And this is going to change the face of the Democratic-Republican Party. Those who flow westward were almost uniformly Democratic-Republican. And the leaders that emerge out of the new generation that follows Jefferson and Madison are entirely different in terms of their goals. We're talking here about a new generation of Democratic Republicans that will dominate the next generation of politics. Henry Clay of Kentucky, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams of New England, and James Madison as well, who emerges as president following Thomas Jefferson from 1809 through 1817. And quite curiously, some of the federalism opinions that we're reading, Fletcher v. Peck, U.S. v. Peters, are occurring under these administrations. So another thing to read, look at the strong statements that are occurring in these cases in which John Marshall is able to extend national power over state power, including, by the way, in Hunter v. Martin's lessee, over the state of Virginia. This is occurring during Virginian's administration. So that's quite important to understand as you look at the trajectory of these opinions. And we'll discuss their broader context more in class. Now, open war would break out between America and Great Britain in 1812. The fundamental issue was likely impressment, which it was fairly serious. Americans on the high seas were being stopped by the British and in some cases being impressed into British naval service on the high seas. And this would lead the war hawks, really John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, to agitate for war, both in the West, of course, and the seas. And they win this, and the resulting vote for a declaration of war in 1812 is commensurated with support from the West and the South and none from New England. And New England during the war behaves, one would say, very sectionally. They don't offer any troops up for national service. They ignore requisitions for militia service. Massachusetts governor actually orders a day of fasting and humiliation to lament the fact that we are at war with the country that parented us. So there's almost a constructive treason, if you will, going on in New England during this time. And the conclusion of the War of 1812 actually brings most of this out, because by 1814, when the war is finally over, the Americans have definitely gotten the worst of it. The Capitol has been burned. The Navy has been obliterated. The only good thing that's come out of it is that they defeat entirely the Northwest Alliance. This is Tecumseh of the Northwest Alliance of Indians. And he is defeated, as are the Indian tribes. Andrew Jackson defeats the Creek in the Southwest. The borders are defended. There's one big victory against the British in New Orleans, which is won by Andrew Jackson. And in the end, they prove that they can stand up, even if they're battered quite badly by the British during the War of 1812. Now, noticeably during this time, the Federalists throw down their own gauntlet. They hold a convention at Hartford. They demand a number of constitutional amendments. They discuss the possibility of secession. They march their demands down to Washington in 1814. News arrives, by the way, of the victory at New Orleans right at the time that the Federalists show up, and that pretty much ends the Federalist Party. After 1814, they're done. They don't even bother running a candidate by 1816, and there aren't any Federalists left by 1820. Now, Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun emerge as the leaders of the Democratic-Republican Party's nationalist wing after the War of 1812. And quite just briefly, they put forward a plan. It takes a while to form it. I'm presenting it as if it comes out complete completely, and it's not the case. But the plan is a broad one of political economy, which looks more Hamiltonian than Jeffersonian, and this actually bothers Jefferson to a large degree. The plan's fairly simple. The idea is to, first of all, establish a protective tariff. And this is based, of course, on the constitutional right to tax. But the tariff will be designed to protect native industries as well as to raise revenue. So the tariff is one leg of this plan. The second is to use the revenues which are raised by the tariff to build internal improvements. And here they're looking at canals and roads primarily. This will tie the country together. It serves a military purpose. It will allow them to move troops around when necessary. And finally, it will also quicken commerce. So this is another part of increasing native industry and building internal commerce. The third leg is to adopt a new national bank. And this is put forward during the Madisonian presidency, the idea of a national bank. And here's something, I just want to lay this out. We can talk about it more in class. James Madison will end up signing the Second Bank of the United States into existence. And this raises a question. Given that James Madison disputed the constitutionality of the bank in 1791, in fact denied the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States in 1791, why does he sign it into existence in 1816? There's a couple of answers to this that I think, or I shouldn't say answers, but a couple of possible explanations. And the ones I offer here do not exhaust the field, but I want you to think about them. One is that Madison valued pragmatism over principle. Another is that Madison got it wrong the first time and right the second time, or vice versa. And a third is that Madison regarded the question of the extent of congressional power in dubious circumstances to be a question of constitutional politics rather than constitutional law, which is to say that Madison's theory of constitutionalism might have allowed for a flexible interpretation of the Constitution when the questions were difficult, and for that interpretation to be handled in the popular branch and in Congress, rather than of the president who wielded the veto. I want you to just mull this over. How is it that somebody like James Madison could move from thinking the bank was unconstitutional in 1791 to thinking it was constitutional in 1816? 1819 would represent the apogee of the Marshall Court. Although McCulloch v. Maryland would occasion a furious reaction from the old Virginia school of Spencer Roane and John Taylor of Caroline and Thomas Jefferson, John Marshall's nationalism seemed to have the upper hand. Henry Clay and John Calhoun were on the ascendancy. The Federalists were all but dead. Their luminaries, like John Quincy Adams, had converted to the Democratic Republicans. But there are storm clouds on the horizon for American nationalism in 1819. Perhaps not unsurprisingly, their source was in the West, in the territory purchased from France back in 1803. In 1819, the expansion of slavery into the Western Territory brought a request of statehood from Missouri. All at once, the storm clouds would burst over Congress when they considered Missouri's application for admission to the Union. But that's for next week.